Reproductive Rights, ILGA, IPPF, and Euro-Asia Pacific. My name is Carrie Shelver, and I'm a member of the Sexual Rights Initiative team in Geneva, and it's my great pleasure to moderate this panel, Autonomy versus Protectionism, Critical Considerations for Human Rights Council on Sexuality and Gender. So before we get started, some logistics. We have people joining us online, so big welcome to everyone joining us online. For those of you joining online, we have interpretation in English, Spanish, and French. By now, I'm sure everybody knows how to do this, but just in case, you select the language of your preference you click interpretation, which is that world icon from your control panel. Then you click the language you'd like to hear. Once you have selected your language, you click on the interpretation icon again and select mute original audio, and from the same menu so that you can hear the interpreters more clearly. Questions, which are welcome throughout the panel, can be typed into the Q&A function, and I'll ask the panelists to respond to these questions during the two designated Q&A segments of the side event. For those of you joining in person, you can also access the interpretation by scanning the QR code with your mobile device. There should be some flyers around in the room with a QR code, and you can just scan that. And Pooja over there with her hand up can also help support you if you struggle with that. Please make sure to use headphones when you are accessing interpretation in the room so that we don't have interference or feedback. Please note also, for security reasons, no one is allowed to take pictures and or video at this event. The event's designated photographer is Margarita over here from the SRI, and she will be taking pictures. We are recording the session on Zoom, and the recording will also be available on SRI's YouTube channel in a week or so. So, in 2004, in an article titled Sexuality, Violence Against Women and Human Rights, Women Make Demands and Ladies Get Protections, legal scholar Ali Miller outlines a paradox that despite all the attention on violence against women in the media, in human rights and countless other spaces, and the fact that these were increasingly framed as women's human rights issues, that violence was nevertheless not understood, not prevented, nor adequately responded to. Miller points to two interconnected phenomena to explain this paradox. Firstly, the rise in practice of respectability politics, where more explosive aspects of sexuality, such as desire or autonomy, are set aside in favor of issues that present less challenge to the systems of patriarchal, racist, and class power. And secondly, protectionism. Protectionism refers to a worldview and attitude that sees certain individuals and groups, notably women and girls and other gendered and sexualized people, as naturally vulnerable to violence and discrimination as requiring the protection of the state and the patriarch. Protectionist policies and practices ostensibly aim to reduce an individual's or a group's vulnerability to discrimination and violence. However, such policies and programs offer their benefits at the expense of people's autonomy and freedom, and fail to address systemic inequality and the root causes of discrimination and violence. Despite their ubiquity, protectionist policies and practices fail to deliver on even the modest promises they make. Instead, these policies more often than not deepen the inequality and marginalization of the very people they claim to protect. This side event will be structured in two parts. In the first part, we will hear three perspectives on protectionist policies and practices relating to gender and sexuality and the impact they have had on women and other marginalized people. We will then open for questions. We will then move to a second round with our panelists as they propose alternatives to protectionist approaches. And we will again open the floor after that segment for questions and responses. So to introduce our panelists. Online, we're joined by Shalini Singh. Shalini has been associated with CREA for over 15 years, and she leads a program with adolescents and young women in India on SRHR and access to safe public space. a program to build leadership capacities of women to challenge oppressive norms and structures at individual and community level. Her work has been focused on the design and implementation of capacity building programs that foreground the integration of gender transformative approaches being implemented by women-led organizations. So thanks, Shalini. To my left is Lobna Darwish. Lobna leads the Gender and Human Rights Program at the Egyptian Initiative for Personal Rights, EIPR, a partner of SRI. The program focuses on public morality and criminalization, gender-based violence, and SRHR. EIPR is a Cairo-based human rights organization working since 2002 to protect basic rights and freedoms in Egypt through research, advocacy, and supporting litigation in the fields of civil liberties, economic and social rights, criminal justice, gender, and their intersections. Hi, Lobna. And then to my right, but only in position, is Anthea Taderera. Anthea is a queer African feminist lawyer with a keen interest in African feminist approaches to human rights law and policy. She currently works as the advocacy advisor on the UPR at the Sexual Rights Initiative, focusing on rights relating to gender and sexuality. Hi, Anthea. So we're going to start with our first speaker, which is Anthea. Anthea, can you tell us more about the potential consequences of protectionism in terms of curtailing rights, freedoms, and autonomy, both within states and in international relations?
Thanks, Carrie. In both the domestic and international sphere, the two modes of protectionism I tend to be interested in are paternalism and infantilization. And as Carrie already stated in her introductions, protectionism curtails rights, freedoms, and autonomy ostensibly for the good of a vulnerable population, so paternalism, or to protect populations from themselves because they inherently don't know any better, so infantilization. And both these modes are proffered as a way to address a societal problem. So in the example of addressing violence against women in public spaces, such as street harassment or women being stripped of their clothing for violating social ideas of modesty and appropriate dress, or sexual violence, some states and other institutions of social power may resort to limiting women's access to the public sphere and public space as a response to the violence that women face outside. So it's outside that is bad. They may limit women's ability to work outside the home, or to work at night, or to travel for work on the basis that it's unsafe. So you just stay at home because home is great. In that way, protectionism is used to curtail the rights and freedoms that are linked to any departure from the private sphere, such as working, or our freedoms of movement or association, or exercising our rights to bodily autonomy. They restrict outside and access to outside and our experiences of outside, regulating how women can inhabit these public spaces and how we must behave when we get there, right? There's a right way to be outside. You can't just have no home outside training, just be out there. This is all very convenient for states because in this sense, protectionism discharges states of their obligations to protect the rights of women, to prevent harm, to address harm. The behavior of women can thus be considered as a form of contributory negligence because good women are supposed to be at home. Protectionism allows the state to not create a public space that is also fit for purpose. We are subjected to the exclusionary design of the public sphere, inadequate public transportation, inadequate pollutions, poor lighting. And so outside is made this transition point. And if you linger on it, you risk triggering classist and often colonial vagrancy laws that are used against informal workers, against sex workers, against the poor, the racialized, and the undesirable others that are terrorizing the outside for the good people. And in this way, protectionism opens the space for increased state surveillance of space, of behavior in the space, and also for self-surveillance, for intracommunal surveillance and state sanctions. It allows for the criminalization of populations that attempt to exist in the space or are being present in the space whilst they are unwanted. If we think, for example, how we treat people who are homeless, right? Increasing the risk of police violence and other carceral responses to what are fundamentally social problems or social issues. And invariably, this idea of protecting, this protectionism as deployed by states is not intended to protect everyone. Often the idea of who needs to be protected when we're thinking about women's rights will have an idealized female subject in mind who is pedestaled and yet paternalized, who is deemed weak and fragile and yet mysteriously nefarious, which is why she can't go outside in the first place. And this is often contrasted with a racist, classist caricature of the robust, bad, or fallen woman who is demonized, infantilized, and deemed disposable, and yet curiously influential because she might influence the pedestaled one also to be bad. And we see this, for example, in the settler colonial projects of Southern Africa, where white women were simultaneously pedestaled and subordinated, active participants in the projects of white supremacy, but still dominated by white patriarchy, and where Black women were continuously construed as belonging to inferior races, overly sexualized and dangerous. And in the case of Zimbabwe, they were perpetual minors until 1982, subject to strict past laws with restricted access to education, access to health services, amongst many other things. And we see protectionism at play not only within states, but also in relations among states. For example, in the realm of cooperation, development aid, international financial institutions. We see it in the continual refusal to grapple with what it would really mean to have a global equitable order, what it would really mean to have a sovereign equality of states who also had the rights to use their natural resources to choose their own political and economic systems and trade partners, and to really exercise their rights to self-determination. When we specifically think in terms of rights, we see it in the assumption that some people are perpetual knowers, holders of human rights standards, and others are perpetual recipients. There is an assumption and a narrative that is peddled that human rights are antithetical to Africanness, that African peoples did not have their own systems of rights or entitlements, of human value and dignity in their legal systems, indeed in the assumption that we didn't have and still do not have legal systems. There's an infantilization of individual Black peoples as a collectives, and also of African or Black states, as though we are inherently and inextricably linked to and committed to systems of oppression. And we are perpetually in need of steering, commanding, dominating, and rescuing, and of teaching with regards to human rights. We see paternalism then in the denial of agency of peoples and states, denial of autonomy, the imposition of development and economic approaches with a simultaneous undermining of the rights to development within this, our Human Rights Council. There is a constant supposition that these developmental and financial entities and certain countries know the aspirations of the people better than they do. They know what is good for them, what their priorities are or what they should be, how they should be achieved, and which economic models should be used, even without meaningful consultation, partnership, or cooperation. These people apparently know better than we do the right to self-determination. In the human rights work we do, we see it in the politics of money and agenda setting, how donors have a better idea of what our societies and our communities need in order to advance and attain our rights, because they don't belong to us. They belong to someone's foreign policy agenda. As the council, we also see it in the infantilization and paternalism as a facet of the hierarchical approaches there are to rights, right? The presumption and the assumption that when racialized states are speaking about economic, social, and cultural rights, they are actually nefariously trying to avoid their human rights obligations. They're purposely murking the waters and or being deceptive or conniving by having an interest in these rights, having an interest in colonialism, and having an interest in how the global economy, IFIs, foreign debt, and sanctions affect their ability to meet their human rights obligations. And coming finally, sorry, I think it's been longer than 7 minutes, when we're thinking about the rights relating to gender and sexuality, we see it in our informals with the starting point that there are good and bad states, and that these categorizations are fixed and absolute, and that they are permanent. We see it in the characterization of women deemed to be the subjects of these resolutions, a paternalization of the oppressed, racialized female other by the Western states in particular, in addition to the paternalization of the good women of whatever society a diplomat may be representing, and an infantilization that is illustrated by the racist idea that some nations and some people are inherently so backward that you have to try to trick them into accepting progressive formulations of language that you can use to coerce them, influence them later. And without these and other punitive tactics, think aid conditionality or economic sanctions, Africans in particular will be unable to meet the standards of civilization we're all expected to want, even if we cannot get out of our own ways to attain them, and even if we say we don't want them, because what do we know?
Thanks, Anthea. So Anthea, you spoke already about how states instrumentalize protectionist policies as a way to draw the line between those who are protected, deemed worthy of that, and those who are disposable, and how all of this furthers the sexist, racist, capitalist, and colonial project within states, and critically for us at the Human Rights Council, how these play out between states. But turning to Lobna, how does protectionism function within authoritarian contexts, particularly in relation to women's and other marginalized people's rights? And what are the consequences of its implementation in terms of surveillance, criminalization, harsh sentencing, and limited protection?
Thanks, Carrie. It's great to speak after Anthea because I'm going to build on what she said so beautifully. So I think in the context of authoritarian regimes and countries, protectionism plays perfectly, because on one level, it continues the idea that the state is a protector of everyone. Nobody knows what's good for them, especially women and younger people, and basically gives the opportunity to use the protection of women and girls to extend policing, to extend surveillance, and to normalize harsher sentences, long prison times, and higher fines. And this is played in a very specific way, because first of all, what protectionism does is that it naturalizes victimization of women and girls. It says, it considers that this is the first step that we're moving from, that violence has to happen, it happens, it will happen forever, and therefore our only intervention as states, or like sides of duty of care, basically, is to intervene after the fact or just before the fact, but not to look at structural reasons why this violence happens and why these groups in particular actually find it harder to evade situation of violence. So first of all, it cleans the responsibility of the state of justice, gender justice in the cases of women and girls, and why they're more vulnerable to violence. But the second thing is that it gives the state only one responsibility: to punish. So the state comes in after the case of violence with high punishment for the person, which is like usually a man, seen in class-wise in a certain way, seen as basically the only reason for violence against this woman or girl. And for example, we have an examples not only in Egypt but in other countries, how trying to combat sexual harassment in the street under this guise, the whole surveillance of the metro system started. It's not only in Egypt, it happens in different places. It's systematic, but in Egypt, see it clearly happening in 3 years. All the guises about like sexual harassment in public spaces. And we see it continuously in harshening of sentences 1 year after the other against any gender-based violence issue. But at the same time, it does not deliver on anything related to justice. So women are in the same place. These laws look very good internationally. And speaking of to what Anthea has been talking about, so yes, that is the idea that certain societies and certain places are conservative, cannot accept, women's autonomy. But also this is a two-side game. So on one side, there is expectation, but also states from these countries play the game to the other side. So it presents that the culture is to be blamed, that people are to be blamed for this conservatism or for whatever violence happening. And therefore, everything the state does and intervenes is it washes all the human rights violations done on other files, and even washes the fact that it does not do very well, or actually does very, very little when it comes to protection of women against violence. So it plays this crucial, or like I would say, crucial role in creating the idea of the very strong state and the need to very authoritarian state and little questioning of use of violence and prisons and laws. And also sends a message that the only way to intervene in society is not through education, is not through services, is not through healthcare, it's not through giving people opportunities and rights, but actually through the law, and especially the penal law. So you find that even continuously in laws criminalizing violence, that does not put a responsibility on the state. All it introduces is penalties after the fact has already happened. This is also this also relates to a wider situation related to how we see the role of women themselves as part of this. So these laws are basically developed and followed, but without any participation from women and girls themselves and different groups. I'm talking about women and girls, just an example. The groups are not there. Therefore, they end up actually being very not useful. They're not accessible. Police stations are not accessible. Prosecution officers, even within the criminalization, these spaces are not accessible. And instead of focusing on something like reporting rates, so we can know how people can access these systems, we focus on how harsh the sentences is as a performative position from the state saying that we're against violence. But this happens also in collaboration with something else. We're not only protecting women in public spaces, and it's always public spaces. The home is lovely, as we all know, because this comes in some situations and many authoritarian contexts with a protection of the family and romanticization, making it romantic, making the family such a romantic space and the home such a romantic space. And this plays kind of together a role of basically reinforcing the message within the family that protectionism is the only way to protect the girls and women within that family, which kind of gives more space and legitimacy to violence and denying access for women and girls to public spaces, movement, information, the internet. The internet becomes this crazy place and this very dangerous place. So it plays together, this protectionist approach plays this together by reinforcing the family as the only safe space possible without any intervention to protect people within the family and ensure any form of justice within the family. And the other side, telling the family that you should protect more and more the girls and women. But at the same time, this happens in a context that is above all economic. Lack of services, lack of ways to get out of violent situations. So, for example, we penalize a man for violence against his wife, let's say, but at the same time, she has no place to go. She has no way for her to afford the education of her children or healthcare or whatever. So she ends up having no choice but to stay in this violent situation. And this tells you how when we start from the middle of the road, instead of seeing the whole picture, we end up actually not helping people, and with very low, even in protection, it fails, I would say.
Thanks very much, Lobna. We're going to now hear from Shalini, who I hope is online. And so Shalini, our question for you is, how does protectionism impact access to resources, opportunities, and information for marginalized people, such as women with disabilities and young women? So Shalini, over to you.
Thanks, Carrie. Thanks a lot. And thank you, Anthea and Lobna, actually, for sharing all your points. It is also giving me a lot of relevant information, which is very, I can just relate to those information. So although I'm going to focus on a specific content, but all these informations are also very relevant. And I think we have also faced some of the similar challenges in our work also. So today, maybe I will just focus on 2-3 points. And first point will be how protectionism also control access to resources and opportunities for many people who are marginalized, who are structurally excluded because of their ability, because of their religion, because of their caste and location. But particularly, I can share my experience in relation to women with disability and young women. Although feminists have made some progress to prevent gender-based violence, but many of its intervention, we can see that it still address women who are deemed of deserving of protection, such as married and heterosexual women. So women who identify themselves as heterosexual and
Me, can you
hello, so sorry. So I'm particularly going to focus on 2-3 points, and I was just thinking while hearing Anthea and Lobna, because some of the experiences when they were sharing is so relevant for our work also, and similar experiences we have also got. But right now I will just focus on 2-3 main points, which is especially related to women with disabilities and young women, and also other structurally excluded women who are often marginalized on the basis of caste, religion, and location. We have seen in our experience that although feminists have made some progress in relation to preventing gender-based violence, we have also seen that many of our interventions still address women who were deemed deserving of protection, which Carrie, you also mentioned, such as married women or who identify themselves as heterosexual. We have seen in our work while working with women and girls at the ground that often these protectionist approaches take a very paternalistic stance towards the capacity and ability of people who are considered as vulnerable or who can be considered as weak, who need supports and protection from whom. This approach often puts them at risk of discrimination, also violence and harassment. This idea around protection can also manifest in many different forms, and this can be around decision-making process. The person who is getting affected from some of the decisions is not able to take decision about her or his body and around her life, but somebody else, often their guardian or parents, are taking decisions about her. Increased surveillance and control, and also sometimes forced medical treatments. Particularly in institutional settings, we have seen that women and girls with disabilities may be subjected to forced sterilization or contraception without their knowledge, without any information, which is many times commonly understood as a measure of protection. But we know and we have seen that often women and girls actually are put through these process or at more risk, and more abuse can also happen in these process. In order to protect these women and some of the marginalized groups, sometimes we completely erase their fundamental expression and also rights. By not integrating and not including all different expressions, we also then continue to create more marginalizations. Women with disabilities and girls are often not given opportunities to access information. And we have seen this in many experiences, particularly in COVID. They are not getting information, accessible information, because sometimes also we don't feel that they need this information. Many times we have seen that women with disabilities or young girls with disabilities are not even considered as sexual beings who needs these information, who have desire, and who can have agency to decide about their life, partners, or sexuality. And so my experience says that in place of creating more enabling environment, what we do that we increase control on mobility and sexuality of people with disability, which then overall impacts their access to health services and opportunities. So they are, in many cases, they are forever dependent on their family member or on the institutional authorities. So they are not able to create better life, or they are not able to access livelihood opportunities also due to this increased control on mobility and access to information. Another example of protectionism I wanted to share in my from my work is control access to technology. In many examples in India, we have seen that parents and of course often senior community members from the local or the specific regions have tried to access control to technology, digital space. And we know that in 5-6 years, lot of opportunities and informations are available on technology in digital space, which many girls and adolescents, girls and women with disability can access. But due to increased restriction, they are not able to access. So increased restrictions on public space, in-person physical space also gets extended to the digital space as well. So lockdown in India has affected around 150 million of girls, and they are not able to get formal education for their better lives. And many times online and digital learnings, sometimes it is not an even option for girls. In few cases, we have seen how senior members, community members have given dictates on, and we have also seen news around if girls are found using mobile phones outside their home or in public space, they can be fined also. So it is a continuous process. Third point is access to safe healthcare facilities for young women and young girls also. So last year in September, Supreme Court has given a very good path-breaking judgment where they said all women are entitled to a safe and legal abortion, recognizing the reproductive autonomy as a basic right for all women. But in practice, we have seen that healthcare providers continue to be a gatekeepers in the name of protection of abortion to women, and particularly for young women and girls. We have a law around protection of children from sexual offenses, 2012 Act, which is POCSO, and it talks about protection of children from sexual assault, sexual harassment, and pornography, and also provides child-friendly procedures to be followed by the police, medical practitioners, and judges while dealing with sexual offenses cases. And child is also defined in a section as a person below the age of 18 years. But one of the major points under this act is mandatory reporting. And often in our experience, we have seen that mandatory reporting under this act affects access to self-health services for young girls. We keep hearing many incidents when minor girls are denied safe abortion services because of reporting requirements under this act. And under this act, also many people who are social worker, counselors say that it is very complicated and they also need to report these cases. So if girls are denied these access to public facilities or approved medical facilities from doctors, they are most likely to reach going to the backstreet providers who are often not trained service providers, healthcare providers, and who are not often equipped also for these kind of services. So putting their health at risk by accessing these backstreet providers is a big challenge for young girls. Health care providers also many times feel that it is very important to share information related to pregnancy about minor girls to family members. Of course, it is also mandatory reporting. And also sometimes in adult women or single women cases to husband or family members. And due to that reason, often single women also face discrimination from healthcare providers. Although in many cases, we have seen that sexual harassment policies are mandatory for all organizations, which is government or private, but many organizations have failed to implement these policies. And as a result of failure, many women who are facing sexual harassment are not often reporting these cases, and they are not even able to share these experiences with their family members, because the first reaction from family members are often that do not go out or do not go work. So instead of creating enabling environment, we are putting restrictions, we are creating more control mechanism to control mobility and access to public space and opportunities, which is then again, as a result, increasing marginalization and also displacement in many cases. Yeah, thanks.
Especially for giving us some really concrete examples there to kind of show how this impacts in very specific ways. I also just want to acknowledge that many people are having to go off to informal negotiations that are starting or already have started. So thanks to all of you before you leave for making this time. We had thought we would pause now for some questions and answers. I'm not sure if there are any questions online, but I'm going to suggest actually that we just continue with the discussion and then we leave a bit more time towards the end for questions. So do start preparing those questions. And after we've had our second round, we'll then open for the floor. So Shalini, I'm actually going to come right back to you again. So in the second round, our panelists are going to provide some ideas and examples of alternatives to protectionist policies and approaches. So Shalini, starting with you, could you please share with us an alternative framework to protectionism? And if possible, provide an example from CREA's work to help demonstrate how it differs?
Yeah. Thanks, Carrie. So in our work also, actually, we have seen a lot of restrictions and controls are actually shared with, we have increased actually control and access to information because of sexuality. So there is this fear that if girls are going out or women with disabilities are going out, interacting more and more with outside world, so there is chances of sexual assault or big fear of family honor or discrimination around bodies. So, and that is why a lot of laws and policies are also created to increase those surveillance and control. I feel that in our work experience, whatever we have understood, that laws and policies should be more geared towards humanizing rather than differentiating or discrimination. And why I am saying that? Because in our work, in It's My Body work, when we were working with young women and girls in 3 states of India, using football as a tool to talk about body, SRHR, and well-being, and also in that process, building leadership of girls. We experienced that providing comprehensive sexuality education has really worked well with many organizations. So thinking about focusing on prevention than harm, and when we are providing comprehensive sexuality education, we have seen that girls are, or their capacity, they are more capacitated to negotiate around their bodies, their SRHR and sexuality needs. We have also seen that how they have been able to take better decisions around their lives and their well-being. They have been able to negotiate with their family members, with their other community leaders within their specific villages and location also. So they have challenged a lot of several norms around gender by accessing public space also and using football as a tool to talk about their body also. Another thing is also when we are creating laws, how we are including different expressions. So in place of mandatory reporting, I definitely, and a lot of us organizations working with young women have felt that we have experienced that in place of mandatory reporting, we can increase actually access to rehabilitation, counseling, and compensation, and without provide support without taking an FIR route, a first information route. So right now also it is available, but taking those services, support, counseling, and rehabilitation, you have to first go to the police station, lodge an FIR, then only you can access this support system. So if we are providing without FIR, then we feel that it will work for the betterment of young people. So always we feel that best protection we can provide for young people is to center their autonomy and their freedom, along with accurate information, knowledge about their bodies, and also then create enabling spaces that inform their decision-making process. So building their agency and capacity is very important to continue that process so that they are able to take those decisions. As an alternative justice, we have also seen that many times collectives have actually included information around comprehensive sexuality in their everyday meetings, small collective meetings, and it has really worked. So when we are providing, supporting survivors of sexual harms and abuse to have access to multiple information and community-based processes, that also supports healing and provide them rehabilitation opportunities. Women with disabilities and trans people and also non-binary people can become change makers. They are change makers if they are provided and capacitated with knowledge and opportunities. In several domestic violence cases, you know that in India in 2005, we enacted domestic violence cases. And in those cases, we have seen that when we are giving civil remedies, how women are going to approach justice system more and not going to the criminal justice system because of long and delay and tiring process. And it's also civil remedies are focusing more on survivors and complainants than on punishment and taking the punitive mechanism. So that has also worked in many examples I can share. A survivor-centered approach has really worked. So we need to, and we have always tried to seek to empower the survivors by prioritizing her rights, her needs, and her desire, so that we are also making accessible all the information and good quality services. Thanks, Carrie.
I so miss an hour and a half long side events. May they return. And sorry for rushing the speakers through this. So we're going to turn to Lobna. Lobna, how do feminist women's rights and other social justice organizations and groups avoid falling into the traps of respectability politics and protectionist approaches?
So I'll assume that they're allowed to organize and work, at least first word. So I think it's important to always remember how historically organizing against violence against women and girls, there was like other campaigns at the times, other demands that women had and still have today. And it's important to understand the relationship between all these demands. Basically, how siloed violence against women and girls became lately as one issue, unrelated to socioeconomic situation, unrelated to other demands, unrelated to access to services and liberties, is I think the main reason we end up in protectionist approach and sometimes advocating for the protectionist approach. So understanding violence and going back to historically to the moment where we understood violence, or like took the moment of understanding violence and seeing it as a consequence of so much injustices. And the second thing I would say is to build across movements. And I think it's always a good way to remind oneself to see what's happening on the other side when we take these approaches, but also to make sure that we're not forgetting anybody when we're advocating for, the respectable victim, and to see who we're failing in the meanwhile. And the other thing I would say that even if we're taking a legal approach, a mostly legal approach, is to focus on services and ways out before the fact, but also even when you're talking about penalties and penalization, to focus on practical stuff, to basically force governments to step out of performativity, to focus on reporting rates, referral to courts rates, to focus on the access of everybody to that system, instead of encouraging in the state creation of moral panics around specific big cases and higher penalties and a performative, because we end up with like very few cases taking the attention and intervention with extremely performative context that does not help most people actually in protection of their right to live without violence. But also to remember that rights cannot be separated from one another, that freedom of expression is a right as well, freedom of movement is right as well, freedom and access actually to services are rights as well. So it's basically to remember, as if we're stepping back in history, to take the very first step again in our approaches when we're doing our advocacy.
Great, thanks so much for that, Lobna. Anthea, surely it is better for states to protect people than to exploit them or do nothing at all? Is there a way for states to do protectionism and mitigate the worst effects of it? And if not, how can they resist falling into or creating protectionist traps?
Thanks, Carrie. And I guess to be clear from the outset, exploitation is always bad. No to exploitation. But states must remember, and they must be reminded, that their power to legislate and to create policies extends beyond the criminal law. So beyond the introduction of more criminal laws, they can actually do other things with law. And so they need to focus on protecting rights and not people. They need to focus on creating an enabling environment for people to exercise and to enjoy their rights. They also need to repeal problematic laws. So using the example of African states, there was an advisory opinion issued by the African court that was talking about the problems of like lots of these vagrancy laws and laws that are dictating how to access and to use public space in the public sphere as discriminatory against people on the basis of like socioeconomic things. So states could, conform with advisory opinions that are highlighting some of the issues around how they're regulating space and public space. They must also invest in improving the material conditions for women and sexual and gender minorities. They must concern themselves with the redistribution of wealth, with just taxation, with ensuring that the services that Lobna was speaking about are available and accessible, and really just take an economic justice approach within the country, and also extend that to how they're thinking about international cooperation, whether or not they're a donor state. And when we're thinking about what it means for our work in these international or multilateral spaces, by no means are we saying that we must then withdraw from holding states accountable. All states must be held accountable for meeting their obligations. But in that accountability, we must also then resist dictating the approach that states must take to meet their development and human rights agendas, and really recognize the autonomy and agency, not just of the states of the Global South, but also the peoples of the Global South and the activists of the Global South who are helping to carve and to develop the countries and the communities in which they are embedded. And we also need to really meaningfully grapple with culture and cultural diversity and human rights, and recognize that all states have a culture, right? They all have a cultural framework from which they're operating. Culture is associated with brownness or blackness, and also culture is not bad, and cultures are evolving. And so there are conversations to be had about actually sometimes calling states bluffs, or thinking about how cultures are being thought of or evolved within a country, and not approaching it with our racism, right? Which is the starting point. Someone says culture, and you're like, oh, excuses, the Black people are back with their things, right? So culture is not a bad word, and states need to stop acting as though it is. And also when we're thinking about what is our ask, right? So we're hearing many terrible things in multilateral spaces, and we're thinking about what are the kinds of interventions we should be asking for. We need to really grapple with the material ramifications of our ask, of what we're asking for, of the measures that we're taking or that we're suggesting as a means of signaling discontent or disapproval. And we must resist those interventions that seem like they're really easy and they fix everything. And so the things that I always have in mind are like aid conditionality and sanctions, which are just bad, right? They punish everybody, they impoverish everybody, they starve everyone. But our go-to is we must strong arm the people into doing what we want or what we think is good. And we're not actually thinking about the consequences of what our asks are. there are sanctions in Zimbabwe, and people apparently asked for them. I wasn't there when they were asking. Apparently it's for my rights, but I'm just like, when I am there, my family struggles and suffers like everybody else. Nobody says, oh, this one's a queer, so the sanctions don't apply to her, or the economic difficulties don't apply to her, or the collapse of the medical system and education. These ones are special, the sanctions or the aid conditionalities don't apply, right? And so there is a way that we really need to think about what it means to introduce these things that will also adversely impact the groups that the measures are ostensibly supposed to be helping, because we're embedded in our communities and in our societies, and we experience the fortunes of a country, right? And so we really need to ask ourselves truthfully, what makes sense, and not what will make us feel good.
Great. Thanks, Anthea. We now have a few minutes for questions. So both questions online. I'm not sure if there are any questions. Yes, there's some questions online. We're going to take those, and also in the room. So I will start. I think what we'll do is take 2 or 3 questions and then ask the panelists to respond to those. So starting at the back, yes, Khadija?
Thank you, everyone. I wanted to comment on something that you get, my question is for the whole panel. Answer a lot of what's talk about good and bad states and the need to intervene with certain cultures that are backwards or violent. And we see that in play, like, for example, when the US invaded Afghanistan, we were using photos of women before and after Taliban justifying their invasion of Afghanistan. And in history as well, the British did the same thing, using the women of the country they were colonizing to justify their colonization, essentially. So my question is, how can we approach women rights discourse in a way that forgets this idea of like this universal truth that the West thinks is good and what's bad for women's rights?
Hi, my name is Johanna. I'm from Gaza, Palestine. I was just wondering, and we all speak about protection of women in violence. I'm wondering how much the education of boys. And I think that especially in societies like my own, Palestinian society, which is overwhelmingly conservative, that boys are raised in a way that is not necessarily respectful of women and women's bodies and girls and etc. And I think that maybe that can also be, I'm not sure how that can be also incorporated so that we can start from the beginning and not just educate women how to protect their own selves, but also how males need to be respectful of that, and also put laws and legislation in place that would sanction them if they are not. But I'm primarily talking about the educational system.
Okay, great. I think what we'll do is we'll respond to those 2 questions, and then we have another 2 questions from the online participants. So I don't know who wants to. Yes? Okay. Anthea.
So I'm assuming that you're also talking about the challenge of being told that if you are feministing or working on women's rights, you're furthering like a particular kind of Western agenda in addition, right? So there's like that precarious special place for Southern feminists in particular. I think part of it is really having continuous conversations about, on the one hand, thinking about what are the kinds of rights and entitlements that have already been like expressed in like a culture and a region, a community, thinking about the ways in which we have seen people of different genders, orientations, or whatever it is, exercise their autonomy, right? So there is no, like, it's not like everything was good and then white people. There has been like a continuous manifestations of patriarchal power in different kinds of societies and communities, and also emphasizing that the existence of patriarchy in our countries isn't unique in the sense that it's not that in my example, Black men are particularly bad, right? It's that there are continuous systems of subordination on the basis of gender that are created and perpetuated, and having those conversations, right? So being able to do both, being able to talk about the harms of colonialism, the harms of like ways in which power is exercised in an international sphere, and being able to say, and also the patriarchy sucks, and this is how it is manifesting in my experience, and how you're exacerbating even those experiences of racism or of ableism, whatever else that we might otherwise share, and not feeling as though you have to pick a side, right? We can be mad at everybody, right? Like I'm angry at you because like I've been fighting outside and I have to come here and then fight some more with you, and that's okay. And also sometimes it's about thinking about the different kinds of liberation movements and the different kinds of articulations of liberation that we've had access to, even if it wasn't within a feminist framework or didn't espouse an explicitly feminist framework that has been concerned or interested in the situation of women. And I am yet to hear of a place where one of those doesn't exist.
Great. And now I really am longing for that extra half an hour that we used to have. So we have a number of questions, great questions that have been posed. There's no way we're going to get to them, but I'm going to say what they are, just so that we have that. I think these are questions we can continue to ponder on, and maybe there'll be a part 2 to the side event. So one of the questions was around given some of the issues that have been raised and the questions raised by the speakers, how do we make sure that these problems are not being seen as a result of an inefficient state that therefore requires a more efficient, more privatized, more subject to market regulation response? So I guess this question is really looking at the relationship between neoliberalism and violence. Big question. It seems like a topic for another side event. And then there was also a question around the role of special procedures in terms of, how they have taken up the discourse and the analysis and the approach of autonomy as opposed to protectionism, if they've always done that. So I think that there's, again, a very interesting and quite topical question there. And then lastly, a question around policies to protect autonomy rather than encourage its expression, and an example of the headscarf ban. So we have 2 minutes left. I'm not sure if anyone has a minute to take on any of that, or if I should rather just say, that we want to stay in this conversation. I'm hoping that what it's done is it's provoked us all to think about the ways in which many of us who are coming from women's rights organizations or feminist organizations or other social justice organizations are approaching this issue of respectability with an understanding that sometimes the path of least resistance is in fact the one that's most respectable and leaves the systems of power least challenged. And I guess it's incumbent on all of us, irrespective of where we're located, to make sure that we resist that kind of respectability, to challenge and to say the things that put us in the other category, because I think that is actually how we make sure that the progress is actually held. So I'm gonna close there. I want to thank our co-sponsors. So that was AWORD, Center for Reproductive Rights, ILGA, IPPF, and Aero Asia Pacific. I want to thank our excellent speakers. We definitely could have heard more from you, but thank you so much for opening us up to some of these ideas and analyses. I want to thank the interpreters online. I want to thank the wonderful, ever wonderful SRI team who did all the work to realize the side event. And last but not least, I want to thank all of you who took the time, despite the many other things that are going on at this time, to join us online and in person. And may you all have may you all survive the Human Rights Council and have a good summer afterwards. Thanks, everyone.